Well, hi everybody, and thank you so much for joining us at the Kala Ghoda Arts Festival. The first weekend of the festival has just gotten done, and my God, what amazing sessions we've already had. Whether it was Smriti Kiran speaking with Tahira Kashyap Khurana, or it was that amazing Leslie Lewis concert yesterday, I do hope that you've been catching all the action, on our website, which is KGAF 2021. That's where you'll get a link to register as well. Today, of course, we've got some great sessions lined up. There's a body percussion workshop coming up at 6 p.m. And this is, of course, an instructor joining us all the way from Sao Paulo in Brazil. His name is Renato Epstein. We've also got a beautiful book launch coming up at 8 p.m. tonight. This is the book launch of Rahul Mehrotra's, book, which is called Working in Mumbai, followed by a discussion with Kaivan Mehta. And in the coming days, we've got some great sessions lined up for you as well. Some great podcasting workshops. You could actually learn the sitar from Purbayan Chatterjee. You could learn to play the drums with Gino Banks. Let's just say the Kala Ghoda Festival has something for every art lover. Well, over to you, and I do hope that you enjoy today's program.
Hello, Sonam. Am I on? Yes. So, good evening, everyone. I think I'm just getting an alert from the Kala Ghoda tech team to start speaking. So, here I am. My name is Indira Chandrasekhar, and I am the curator of literature at the Kala Ghoda Arts Festival. I'm really delighted to have Ranjit Hoskote present his presentation, The Mass Media and Public Reason, which will be followed by a conversation, a discussion between him and Prem Chandavarkar. Their bios are available to you, the audience, on our website. And so it's really not necessary for me to repeat them. But what I do want to say is their brief bios on the website do not begin to give you a sense of how what great intellects both these individuals have, and what a sense of a grasp of both the public space that they are talking about, as well as their own practice that they engage in with great seriousness and intellect. Are. So I'm really, really touched that they're both here on this platform today. I do want to very quickly say also that Ranjit, it's almost become a tradition that you open the Kala Ghoda literature series with a lecture that sort of encapsulates the moment in time that we are thinking about. So it's a great pleasure indeed. Excuse my somewhat shaky grammar in those earlier sentences, but I think my points came through. Over to you, Ranjit. Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Ranjit.
much. Thank you so much, Indira. And let me just begin by saying what a great privilege it is to be speaking at the Kala Ghoda Festival. It's a festival that I've really grown up with. I've been associated with practically every edition of the festival since it began in 1999. And it's been a great place of learning and sharing. And year after year, hearing so many marvelous colleagues and collaborating with them over time. So, Indira, thank you very much indeed for your very gracious invitation. And it's a privilege to be doing this with Prem Chandavarkar, who I have the greatest respect and admiration for as an architect, as well as a thinker on these key issues and urgencies that really matter to all of us. What does it mean to be a citizen? What is the place of inquiry and empathy in public life? what is the larger transcendental dimension, or how might we seek it, even through our everyday practices, and many other questions to which he's applied himself in writing and in speech over the years. So what I thought I would do today, is my shared screen visible to everybody?
Yes.
Okay, super. So I thought what I would do is to embark on a kind of twin mission here, if you will. One is to take up this question which haunts us all, which is that the mass media today seem to be antithetical to public reason. And especially in the age of fake news and alt news and the clear misuse of the mass media's propaganda by the powers that be, we've come increasingly to think of television, radio, the print media as being fundamentally unreliable. That what they offer us is delusions, veils, misguidance, if you will. And over against that, I want us to be able to see if there is a more redemptive and utopian, maybe nostalgic view of what the mass media have been able to do in quite another kind of mode, that they have, in fact, served their original mandate, which was to support public reason. And by public reason here, I mean classically a space where members of the public, the citizenry at large, may engage in discussion, in debate, in inquiry, into questions that actually concern them or us all. It's a collective space where we also refine these processes by which, in fact, discussion might be conducted, and we move towards seeking common ground. And that's part of what I want to do here. The other part is unabashed nostalgia, and kill me, but essentially I'm going to think about several dead white men. My math has been terrible, so I have to count. 5 dead white men. And there's not a lot I can do about this, because although I have, in fact, been greatly influenced, and I owe a great deal to men and women of diverse races and ethnicities and religious denominations. For my sins, these were among the influential figures who really inspired me when I was a child and a teenager. And I just want to revisit this ground. And seemingly unintellectual as it might be, what I really want to do is to talk about 4 television series that were broadcast between 1969 and 1980, and then subsequently at periodical intervals in various other places. And the theme I want to try and address is precisely this question of how might all of us, for instance, we're all cultural actors, we are part of what is sometimes pejorated as the intelligentsia, the thinking classes, right? So I want us to be able to see how, through a medium like television, for instance, the bridge, the gulf between expert culture on the one hand and popular audiences on the other was sought to be bridged by 4 people of very diverse background, diverse political investments, different convictions. And working through that, I want to see if we might be able to usefully arrive at some notion of what it means to be cosmopolitan. Not as a given that is offered by privilege, but as something that you work your way towards by straddling dissimilar domains, by working across the humanities and technology, by working across the sciences and the arts, and by working across different conceptions of rights and entitlements. So this is broadly what I want to do. And I thought I'd begin by invoking the place where we would have been had we been doing this physically, which is the David Sassoon Library in Kala Ghoda, where the literature section has, since time immemorial, been held. And I signalize the Sassoon because it began as a mechanics institute. It was founded in 1847. This present building was endowed by the influential Baghdadi Jewish Sassoon family in 1870. But this is the history I want to invoke, because the Mechanics Institute's movement really began in Scotland in the 1820s, then spread across the British Isles and elsewhere in the empire, and then really took off. It was a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution. It was founded, I mean, this form of pedagogy was founded, as many of you know, by philanthropists and population of the new industrial townships. Where were they to study or to study further or to pick up on educations that had been broken? So it really was for typically men at that point, later also women of the working classes, to bring them into a larger space of awareness and enlightenment. It's very much an enlightenment project. And when it came to India, it then became part of a larger process of urbanization, of pedagogy,
which is what I did last
and this is what I want to set this as both a physical as well as a conceptual basis for the presentation today. And this is a key figure in that history, John Ruskin. From time to time I begin to wonder if I'm on mute or something like that. Prem, can you hear me? Super.
Okay. I can hear you. Yeah.
Great. Okay. So John Ruskin came into the Mechanics Institute history a little later, but he was an incredibly influential figure. He was, as many of you know, a polymath. He was an art critic. He was also a pedagogue. He was at various points Slade Professor of Art at Oxford. But also at some point in his life, he became deeply involved with the Mechanics Institute project and founded St. George's Guild, which was an expression of his utopian socialism. With William Morris, he was one of the key figures in the arts and crafts movement. And too often, the arts and crafts movement is seen as some kind of nostalgic move to fetishize the medieval. But what it really was a very clear-sighted critique of industrialization and the forms of social and political organization it had thrown up and what it had done in terms of the fragmentation of cultural experience. So from that point of view, if you look at the work of Ruskin, Morris, Kumaraswamy, their disciple in our own context, what you're looking at is really a wager not only on the handcrafted and the beautiful, it's also an appeal to restore respect to the artisan, to look past the mass production of industrialization and the alienation of labor that industrialization produces, and think about what it means to be an artisan, what it means to be someone who's far from being alienated from her labor. And there's a fluid continuity between the aesthetic imagination, the production of artifacts, and a connection to the consumer. And Ruskin, this quote that I have from him says it all. He genuinely believed, across all his many investments in the aesthetic and in the political, he genuinely believed that if you had to teach art, you really had to teach everything. And that's the premise on which his own take on the Mechanics Institute proceeded. And what I'm trying to do now is to trace the Ruskinian arc as briskly as I can in about 15 minutes through these 4 television series of the 70s that I'm going to be talking about. Now, Kenneth Clark was the brain behind this TV series, which went on in 1969, and which I saw actually as a 10-year-old in 1979. And remember the incredible effect it had on me to see this figure of great authority, wandering hither and yon. He was in the Uffizi, in the Prado, he was in the Louvre, commenting as it might be on the winged Nike or a Raphael painting, the School of Athens. And what Civilization did, the series, and it was correctly called a personal view, was to offer a view of West European civilization, essentially visual arts and architecture, but also taking in drama and literature, so on, from the so-called Dark Ages to pretty much 19th century modernity. And of course, he was widely criticized even in his own time as being connoisseurial, as being foppish. That account left out most of the rest of the world. Even within Europe, it had nothing to say about Al-Andalus, the 700 years of Arab Spain, where there were no dark ages. That was the brightest light of that period. And many people from Christian Europe sought inspiration there. Whatever his limitations might have been, and there were many, I would like to place him in this little narrative of mine for 2 reasons, or several reasons. One is to think about how Clark, although he had admittedly this connoisseurial approach to artifacts, to artistic production, was still concerned with the Ruskinian humanism. He had a larger sense that the arts were embedded in the fabric of society and politics, and that culture was not to be seen in a vacuum. It had to be seen as part of a larger human adventure. And remember that Clark was, despite his being seen as an elitist and a fop and all the rest of it, the truth is that he had actually gone out of academia, out of the institutions. At a very young age, he was director of the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. Still at a very young age, he became director of the National Gallery in London. And then, amazingly, he moved to especially after the Second World War, he gave a series of public lectures across Britain. And then he went into broadcasting. He spoke on radio, he went to television, and really was able to use television at this point to serve his dream of bringing the arts to a much larger audience. So if one definition of elitism is that you preserve cultural wealth for the few, this was actually a completely different sense. It was to actually take culture to the many, to the multitudes. So I cannot, but whatever he might have looked like and sounded like, the project was definitely a democratizing project. And we might come back to this, but this is where my story of these experiments in public reason on television, this is where the story begins. It's what I think of as the long 70s, because for me, the 70s really begin in 1967 and 68, with May 67, the great upsurge of Naxalbari here, then with the Praha Spring in 68, and then Paris 1968, and Mexico City and Dhaka and everywhere else. It was the articulation of a generation that had come of age. In South Asia, essentially post-partition, post-Nehru, in West Europe and North America, post-World War II. And it was the voices of this generation that we heard at that time, but also generations prior who had gone through other experiences of two world wars, the Holocaust, with a certain critical perspective on the atomic bombs, Vietnam. All that fed into what I'm calling the long 70s here, and it had an incredibly bracing effect on culture. So now John Berger was a far more autodidactic figure. We all know his work. He trained as an artist, was sustained by an environment of artists and writers, saw himself as always being outside the institutions, gave up criticism to pursue his own work in poetry and fiction, but always will be associated with this early 1970s TV series, Ways of Seeing. And, if Clark exuded a certain sense of infallible authority, almost papal authority, although that wasn't his tonality, Berger's series was really set distinctly against that. And he moved away from a Clarkian emphasis on connoisseural consideration of the object to questioning how we see, what perspectives we bring, and how those are conditioned by gender, race, class, and so on. So Ways of Seeing, for many, many students of communication, is identified with the distinction that Berger makes between the naked and the nude. How there's a self-confidence to the naked figure, but that the nude is always offered for the delectation of the gaze, typically the male gaze. So you see Berger also as a radical voice, a voice even of feminist concern. So someone who was very much in tune with the critique of the Algerian War, the Vietnamese conflict, was in tune with the civil rights movement and the expression of the rights of women, of people of other sexual preferences, other races, and so on. So once again, I would like to see the space of television as far from being the idiot box. It actually is a space and a domain that opens up to different perspectives and to different worldviews. Another of my, I have to say, childhood and teenage heroes is Jacob Bronowski. And remember that all these series followed each other in quick succession. So Bronowski brought a very different kind of ethical perspective to his doings. He was also a polymathic figure. And some of you will remember that he trained essentially as a statistician, was of Polish origin, but really committed himself to Britain. Straddled the worlds of Oxbridge as well as the new universities that were developing outside of that ambit. Was involved with the aftermath of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, an experience that actually transformed him into someone who sought a deeper meaning to life, someone who critiqued violence, and who wanted to see if a larger sense of global culture was possible. So he's someone who straddled the world of mathematics, of biology, of poetry. He wrote poetry, and he was a William Blake expert as well. So I remember being transfixed by uh, The Ascent of Man as it was shown on black and white Bombay Doordarshan in the late 70s. Uh, and to just see how Bronowski wanted to traverse the world and see what it was that brought the different aspects of culture together. What were the acts of making that served as an afterlife to violence, to war? What persists? What continues? I think these are vital questions that we continue to ask ourselves. And once again, I make the point that television was a vehicle or a platform for such large questions, which left you transformed as a viewer. You weren't a passive observer. And the last of my slides here, Carl Sagan, a Cornell, Harvard, and then a Cornell astrophysicist, very involved with various missions into space, yet also deeply conversant with the histories of science and of culture. And if I bring these four figures together, it's also because each in his own way embodied this ability to transcend the more professional and disciplinary bounds of the arts and the sciences, the humanities and technology. So again, when I think back to my own formation in this period, I was just thinking that as a child of the space age, I was of course fascinated by the Apollo missions, by the search for extraterrestrial intelligence and so on. And Sagan's Cosmos from 1980, which I saw a few years later, really helped one to bring all of these strands together, to be able to achieve some sense of how infinitesimal we indeed are as a species. So long before our own misdeeds have brought that to bear forcefully on us in recent years, it was really gesturing towards the Anthropocene, or the Capitalocene, as we might call it, and reminding us of our space, our place in a much, much larger history of knowledge, of responsibility, and of the coming together, the convergence of both of inquiry and of empathy and ethical standpoint. So, and of course, it was many, many years later that it occurred to me that Cosmos was not just a large signifier for this set of harmonic relationships that bind us to the universe. It also is the name of a text that stands at the beginning of the Enlightenment, Alexander von Humboldt's multi-volume book called Cosmos, which was his similarly polymathic, great bringing together of the various sciences to remind us of how, in fact, we're defined by our interrelationships to other species, to the natural world, and to the larger planetary systems. So, in conclusion, because I really want to get on to the conversation with Prem, I want to see these as experiments in public reason, which also brought us into an awareness of what we could be. They did not pander in any way to our limitations. They invited us to expand ourselves beyond our current horizons. They invited us into a space of intellectual curiosity. They invited us, as I've said earlier, to participate in the larger human adventure and to maintain a certain criticality. And it's this that I want to conclude with. In what ways, and we've lost this in the mass media, and I invoke these experiments because they remind us that mass media programming can yet focus on knowledge, on the imagination, on criticality, and to really bring us to a much larger and more effective and productive sense of ourselves as citizens participating in larger questions. Now, it's not a coincidence that this degeneration of the mass media follows the larger degeneration of the civic space. The rise of demagogic populism is perfectly mirrored by our mass media, which pander to exactly that kind of ideology, and they sustain that kind of sensibility. How might we return to the possibilities that are reserves, as I've tried to point out and I've picked four. There were many others, indeed. And I'll end by paying my homage to the figure of the popularizer. And I think that it's a spirit that pervades or should pervade this festival too, and all such festivals at their best. Because there's a place for the public intellectual, for someone who is immersed in his or her own domain, yet makes that larger connection to the broader citizenry. There's a place for the polymath who straddles disciplines. But the popularizer also takes a great risk. And I'll end with this notion of risk. The popularizer risks being seen as someone who's vulgarizing his or her discipline. That's the view from within the discipline, because popularizers try out new kinds of language. They seek communication. And on the other hand, they run the risk in the broader space of being seen as connoisseurial, out of step, pedantic, and all of this. And yet, this is the ground, this is the gray zone that they repeatedly have gone out to embrace and to offer their services to, in some sense. So I'll end with this homage to the popularizer, and now look forward to a conversation with Prem and then with Indira. Thank you so much for your attention.
I had a thought that the way we would structure this conversation would be that I would make a set of statements which might seem exaggerated, but perhaps because the intention is to be polemic and provocative, so that we have an interesting conversation. And then you can respond to that, and then we can take it from there. The first point I would like to make is related to your title, where you talk about mass media and public reason. And the idea of public reason is really something that has come out of the Enlightenment, because rationality was actually the argument for overturning a feudal order, because every person had the inherent capacity to be rational and creative, to construct new ideas. And that has created the belief that there is a public realm of truth, and we can build consensus on that realm. And there's been a sort of trend in Western philosophy building on this, starting with someone like Rousseau in the days of the Enlightenment, talking about the general will. But in more recent times, people like John Rawls or Jürgen Habermas, who sort of argue that if we have undistorted communication, a common conviction based on rationality can then ensue. Contrasting to that is perhaps a line of thought that I identify more with, which starts with someone like Hannah Arendt, who talks about an inescapable pluralism, that we can't come to this realm, and all we can come to consensus on is the institutions through which we will interact, and everything is inherently political. Or someone like Walter Lippmann, who in his book Public Opinion says that the idea of the truth is always too complex. And what happens in media is you construct images of the truth through which you can manufacture consent. And that's a phrase he coined, and then later Herman and Chomsky picked that up to make it the title of their book, Manufacturing Consent, to argue that mass media is inherently propaganda. So there are these sort of two conflicting sort of realms. And so I mean, is public reason actually a myth that, and in fact, has it become a destructive myth that assumes that we can build this space of truth? You're muted. Yeah, over.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you so much for that, Prem. And I have to say that I mean, my social sciences training veered very strongly towards the Frankfurt School. So indeed, Habermas's Öffentlichkeit was very, very significant to me. But even as we were engaging with it as students, I mean, I remained fully aware that one cannot and does not have an angelic public space, a public sphere of the kind that Habermas envisioned. But I would like to, another thinker I'd add here would be somebody like Chantal Mouffe, whose notion of agonism refers to this notion that the public sphere is where you play out contending interests. And I see the connection between that and Hannah Arendt's inescapable plurality of views. I would my view of this is quite simple, and what the mass media could do, at least in this brief moment that I outlined, and in various other societies at other moments. Uh, I don't know if for a brief moment the mass media could have provided us with the semblance of this angelic public space. And to do so not by play acting consensus or agreement in any way, but by precisely being a clearinghouse for different kinds of ideas, allowing these perspectives to contend, and to provide in the process what you might want to call affordances or capacities to viewers to be better informed, to be imagining and inquiring subjects. That's the thread in this that interests me greatly. It's a precarious, it's a vulnerable, fragile thread within mass media practice, and for obvious reasons, because mass media has usually been supported by institutions that don't want citizens to be terribly well informed. So this is this is the thread that I've been following through. But I completely agree with you that it would be futile to try and see public reason as a given. And of course, if you go back to the Kantian origins of the idea of public reason, it's understood that all participants in public reason are well informed and so on already, which they really are not, and they can't be. Or if they were, then we're talking of a very small minority. I think the promise of the mass media, certainly in the long 1970s, I think the promise was that one could enlarge that space of participation, and that the mass media could play some kind of role in that.
But it could play some kind of a role, but we've inverted things and put too much faith in mass media. We say that mass media is the primary space of dialogue, of engagement. It's where all of this happens. And if you look at the physical public realm, for example, and here I come in with my background as an architect and urbanist, and we've reduced the public realm to something that's politically and intellectually very passive. We just put it as a space for movement, recreation, leisure, consumption. So the whole kind of notions of engagement which we expect of the media are not sort of replicated in our physical spaces. Adding to that a bit of media theory of someone like Neil Postman, who argues that with the advent of television, news and entertainment came from the same device. So we reduce news and this whole realm of public reason to the level of entertainment, and I think a sort of perfect illustration of that is the last US presidential debate, where very complex issues were raised and the candidate was asked to summarize their position on them in 2 minutes. So we have this whole problem. And the other thing about you mentioned these shows, but each of these shows had a life, right? So they ended, then you went to the next show, and that's the other point that someone like Postman makes. We just get into a news of the day in this realm of public reason. So we need to think of something else where there is the common thread, because what we tend to do in life is actually have an alertness every day which affirms what we believe is eternal. That because if what was eternal was always there, it would become habitual and we'd cease to see it. But it's because we reclaim it and affirm it and sort of make it reborn every day, we have the sense of being alive, which media doesn't provide. So perhaps I should ask you this, because you're not just a sort of public intellectual, you're also a poet, you're also a translator. And since this is a literature question, we should get into issues like what literature can offer. So, for example, we have someone like Italo Calvino in his 6 memos for the next millennium, talking about qualities of lightness and quickness, and why literature should endure and will endure, because it possesses these qualities that other forms of expression do not have. And he's basically talking at the millennium and the dominance of television, which was seen as a threat, and the dominance of the internet, which was coming in. And one of the points he makes is that, and this comes back to the issue of public reason, he says that We have to look at the world the way the poet does, not with the direct gaze of reason, but with the indirect gaze of metaphor, which goes into, say, writings of someone like Jeanette Winterson, who talks, and I think it's very intriguing that if you, the book of essays I refer to, when you first pick it up, you think it's called Art Objects. And then you start reading it and you realize it means art objects. And so art is something that resists the decay and entropy of life by this rebirth, this affirmation. And that's not something that media is designed to do.
I agree. I think it has to do with the temporality of the media, particularly what I was talking about there. The television is a medium. The swift succession of images, the need for a certain kind of momentum, it tends to cut against what you've been talking about. So art does, at its best, remain a ground of resistance for us. But how might one bring that into the mass media? Or is that a paradox? That's something that I've been wrestling with as part of this little media archaeology that I've been working on. I don't know if we have an answer to that. I'm not yet ready to give up completely on the mass media and what they offer. But would you say that it's absolutely intrinsic to the medium, to its literally its physical parameters and context?
I think it is intrinsic to the medium because even especially television, which has the hypnotic flicker like a fireplace does. You know, if a television is on in the room, even if you don't like the program, you can't help but watch it. And the other thing about television, unlike reading a book, is that it controls the pace. You have to stay with the pace of the because it's a sort of linear narrative, and you can't slow it down. So I think, but I don't know, one of the things that intrigues me is that perhaps there are some new possibilities, and this is perhaps a design challenge and not just a philosophical one.
Yeah, absolutely.
The fact that now media has gone mobile. You carry a media device in your pocket. So that opens up an opportunity for a media design that links the physical and the virtual. And perhaps that is a space that we can build upon as But let me get to another aspect of which is to do with this reliance on public reason. Is reason by its nature is highly disembodied, and one of the phrases I've used is the way the typical university classroom or even school classrooms are constructed. It's this world which is supposed to depend on reason. And I say that every classroom should have a sign outside sort of revealing its logic that it doesn't state, which is, please bring your head in, but leave your heart at the door. And so the thing about emotion is inherently embodied. I mean, there's some wonderful passages by William James on this where he talks about, can you talk about grief without the sense of weight in your body? Can you talk about anger without feeling the palpitation? How you can't have anything without that embodied aspect. So I think that's why it is necessary to tie the virtual and the physical, especially, and I think that's become much more apparent in the last 1 year during the pandemic, where we've been driven to virtual modes such as this, where we lose all the nonverbal clues, we lose the potential for serendipity. And these, in terms of building some sense of an imagined community, which, as Benedict Anderson very well put it very well, is perhaps the very necessary thing that we should pursue now. And so that is why I come to this tying the physical and the virtual, but bringing in the embodied sense and bringing in the emotional, that perhaps, and not recognizing this in sort of relying on this notion of public reason, We have created the kind of split that someone like Partho Chatterjee talks about of political society and civil society, where political society civil society and political society, and civil society talks about rule of law and secularism and principle and reason, and political society is tribal and emotional and is based on actually sort of moving people in sort of a very direct, charged way. And a lot of us as intellectuals tend to imagine that political society doesn't exist. Or perhaps if it exists, we say it's a pre-modern space and we will preserve the space of sanctity and modernity, and they can perhaps catch up with us and come into it. So I think this reliance on reason, we are sort of creating pits that we tend to fall into ourselves.
No, I agree with you. I think there's, I mean, I would not discount the role of affect in any way. I think when I'm thinking of public reason, I'm also aware of the limitations of the Enlightenment project. I mean, in a profound way, where we are today is the result of the Enlightenment project too. Just the notion of the sovereign, the human species as the sovereign species, and all of nature as being exploitable resources, and then the notion of an instrumental reason. So I'm not a kind of uncritical fan of reason in any way, but also with respect to the distinction that Partha Chatterjee makes, it's true. I mean, political society has the upper hand. So I'm not for one moment suggesting that we retreat into this space and regard that as the sacrosanct ground of the modern. I think it's a far more complex and layered modernity that we have here that's unfolding. So I think all of this needs to be. We need to keep this in mind. Something that you just said, Prem, I kind of lost track of that, but I'll come back to it. The design challenge question. Yeah, because part of what I had in mind here also was to look forward to our own media moment. As you're saying, our experience now is hybrid across multiple media. How do we bring all of that into alignment, and what does it do also for our sense of being a sovereign subjectivity? I mean, we're all kaleidoscopic selves distributed across the various media in which we participate now. So, yeah, that is going to be an open-ended question for all of us.
Perhaps a way forward is to we tend to still believe we can define something like the public interest.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't look at the fact that what is really happening are competing private claims to define the public interest.
Sure.
And perhaps what we should seek unity in, because the public interest ideal builds this notion of a public truth.
Yeah.
And perhaps what we should build unity is not unity of truth, but unity of purpose. That all of us feel the need to be anchored in something that is greater than us. And how do we construct our communities, both physically and virtually, so that we can create a public realm that is not just rational? And if I critique reason, it's not because I want to do away with it.
No.
It's just that because I realize its limitations. In fact, I would agree with Habermas when he says that modernity is an unfinished project. But how we can create a public realm that is rational in some ways, but is primarily dialogical.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something we have not devoted ourselves to. And so the problem is we tend to we've created a sort of fragmentation where the bulk of society is believed to be passive and follow the lead of experts. And the experts might be politicians, or it might be figures like Kenneth Clark or Bronowski who tell us what society is. In that way, I think the one who sort of doesn't fit easily into the fore is John Berger. And Berger is very much a person who's talking about embodied seeing. He's not the disembodied reason at all. And I think what someone like Berger captures, that's captured by something that Joseph Campbell said in an interview with Bill Moyers. where he said that it's wrong to believe that we're searching for the meaning of life. We're searching for the rapture of being alive.
Absolutely.
And Campbell argues that that's really the purpose of myth, because myth creates this resonance between something outside us and something within us, our innermost being, and that's when we really feel the rapture of being alive. And that picks up what someone like Ramanujan argues, that the value of a myth is not in some authentic original or in some truth it contains, but in the way you are transformed by your telling or hearing of it.
Absolutely. Actually, this was meant to be a much longer concourse of figures. So Joseph Campbell, Myths to Live By, was something that I had on my list. He was another of the popularizer, the bridge figures that I had. But what also brings these four figures, with their admittedly very different starting points, for me anyway, is what I think of as wonderment. So actually, whilst Berger is the most radical and critical of the four, each one of these people, that's what they bring across. And I think that's what makes these, if you will pardon the expression, what makes these television classics is precisely that sense of constant curiosity about the world, a refusal to be encapsulated in such quick dogmatic solutions, and this what you call rapture and what I would call wonderment, the sense of the adbhut. That's very powerful in all four. Clarke is not persuaded that these are final realities either. I mean, I think what keeps him going back to his subject is because the wonderment is inexhaustible. Likewise, Bronowski. Likewise, Sagan. I mean, Cosmos it stands out for that sense of incredible wonderment. So, yeah.
I agree. And in fact, I have a paper which I presented once, which is on teaching wonder. And this is precisely why I argue for limiting the reach of reason and rationality, because unfortunately that's a major damage the modern education system has wrought. We're all born intuitively into wonder. It comes so naturally to us as children.
Yes,
but we are schooled out of it, and there are few people who have the inner conviction to sustain it despite their schooling. And there's a wonderful piece by Ram Dass where he says that parents would show him pictures of their children and say, doesn't the innocence of my child resemble the innocence on the face of the Buddha? and he argues no, because the innocence on your child's face is before that child has confronted all the desire and other complexities latent within them, and you don't know what's going to happen to that innocence once they confront it. And whereas the Buddha is someone who's confronted it and come out on the other side with that innocence intact. So, I use that to argue that the goal of education should not be the certification of sophistication, but the preservation of innocence.
That's a beautiful thought, actually. It reminds me of an image from Charles Correa that I often go back to when I talk about his work. I forget which of his essays it's in, but not Eklavya. He says that in a classic North American view of education, when you think about school, you think about a red brick box. But even if he's romanticizing the Indian context, he says in an Indian context, you think of the teacher and the student sitting together under a tree. So I think there's some truth to that, sort of hierarchical regimentation of education and this more open and responsive form of learning.
Yeah, one last statement to expand on that before I hand it over to Indira to bring in audience questions is Louis Kahn said that the first school was a man under a tree who did not know he was a teacher talking to a bunch of children who did not know they were students.
Yes, what a beautiful thing to end on. Really, what a fantastic, fantastic journey the two of you have taken us on. Ranjit, you triggered this incredible conversation between you and Prem, so thank you. I want to take the privilege of having this spot here to ask the first, well, not question is the wrong word, but maybe raise the first point. In a sense, this conversation, this whole lecture, presentation, your whole set of points that you raised, Ranjit, came about because we were talking about really presenting Kala Ghoda in a virtual space, which we both recognized has changed the accessibility for a huge range of people, students, poets, writers who are not able to be in the physical space. So that was, I think, one of the triggers for this very conversation, and the conversation we then had, which triggered all this nostalgia and its purpose, in a sense, in you. So I wanted to just raise that point and ask if you have any comment on either of you, on the fact that we are doing this virtually, which you already addressed in a sense through the idea of the design, but the fact that we are doing this virtually and is being viewed all over the world, really, or could be viewed all over the world, and the very fact that it is right now permitted to do that. We are able to do that. We have the powers that be that allow this medium to exist are permitting this to happen, and the restrictions that come on, either through the use of the medium and the device, or also through the people who are controlling the medium. So that was one thing I wanted to raise ask if you would comment on. And the other thing that I was interested in was this Kantian notion that everybody is well informed, and its confluence with democracy. I was just wondering if that was a question that you could comment on, both of you.
Let me respond to the first one. I tend to be an optimist, whilst not being a techno-utopian. I certainly tend to think about what forms of solidarity might be produced out of these moments. But there are many deficits to our current predicament, of course, and Prem's talked about them. But I've certainly found, also from my own experience as a literary organizer and so on, there's a new set of solidarities that we can actually explore, and also do it in a reasonably, it sounds paradoxical, in a reasonably physical way, like this, just subject only to time differences and so on. We're able, for instance, to have more dialogues than before with colleagues who are far-flung across the globe, for instance. We've done readings together, or lectures, or panels like this. Whilst formerly you would have to travel, you could, you couldn't, and so on. So we're now actually discovering points of contact and affinity, and new dialogues are starting up. So there's certainly that's happened. So that's a brief detail, but I thought I'd put it out there, that we might be able to explore new forms of virtual community. Mm-hmm. That was Howard Rheingold many, many years ago, right? Virtual community, around the beginning of the net. It seems like ancient history, but this seems like another kind of take on the idea of a virtual community.
Thank you. Yes.
I think there's definitely some advantages of the virtual, in the sense that you're not constrained by geography. Mm-hmm. So the new kind of interactions you can have people from all over the world participating in a session. But that should not allow us to lose sight of the value of what is done in the physical. And I think moving on, we'll probably look at a sort of hybrid mix of the two. And just to illustrate what you could get in a physical, which is totally lost in virtual, is to be in an auditorium or a lecture hall, and you have a very compelling talk or a discussion on stage. Mm-hmm. And when the discussion gets that compelling on stage, the stillness of the audience has a palpable energy to it. The second thing is that, okay, I get fired by that energy. Yeah. As soon as a formal event, the discussion ends. In a virtual realm, you just switch it off and you go on to something else. But here, what tends to happen is you come outside, you linger, you meet with people, you talk. There are discussions that. So I think we have to be now more aware of both and sort of choose wisely about how we mix them.
Yes, the human.
Yeah. Coming back to your Kantian notion, the idea of everyone being well informed is, I think the argument that needs to be made there is that you need to be well informed, not just to protect an other, that to say you should be doing this because there are people less privileged than you. Yes, that is definitely a reason to doing it. But you need to be made aware that you also need to protect yourself. Because if you choose not to be well informed, and you tend to sort of choose to live in a certain bubble, I think one thing you're always aware of, more often you don't admit it to yourself, but you're always aware of the fragility and limitedness of that bubble. And that creates a great sense of fear. And you see that. And I think Anand Girdharidas put it very well. He said that our politics is based on the idea of a common republic, but we fractured into two republics, a republic of fear and a republic of dreams, which have very little to do with each other.
Thank you. Yes, yes. We have a question from the audience. How would you see the image of the tree in the contemporary technologies? I think you were speaking of that a little bit already. And Brinda, of course, says thank you, Ranjit and Prem. And yes, so that's nice. Yes, so the image of the nostalgic Gurukul.
The Gurukul. With its ups and downs. Just a quick footnote, meanwhile, to agree with Prem that, occasions like this, when they're physical, they have all the energy and the unpredictability of a concert, for instance. And that's something that we do miss when we're completely online. But coming back to the question about the tree, let's take that as a metaphor, really. I mean, it's not only about sitting under the tree, it's also about being in a space of learning without walls. It's also about being directly in touch with a whole series of experiences that otherwise get mediated into abstractions in a more regimented and hierarchical form of education. It's also an ability to respond through the senses just as much as through the intellect. So cognitive, affective, all dimensions of the self are released to the world. So I think to me, that's what the tree means. And it's not impossible to do it today. We're thinking about a gear shift in education. And it strikes me that an earlier subtitle that I had is what I should have stayed with. I'd meant to talk about these things as experiments in public pedagogy rather than reason. But I'm glad that we are discussing pedagogy in any case. And because you can't really move towards what I've been thinking of, this notion of a larger sense of our affordances and capacities as human subjects, without thinking about renewed forms of pedagogy.
To me, the idea of the tree is that it's such a powerful and environment that's imbued with life, and it makes you aware of the fact that both teacher and student are within this environment that's greater than them. And that can actually start shaping pedagogy, because you realize you're talking about something that's greater than either teacher or student.
Yes.
So then the space of the classroom doesn't become this very neutral, passive space for the transfer of knowledge. It becomes a space for the infection of passion.
Wonderful. I think our time is coming to a close. The infection of passion. We shall stay with that. Thank you both. It was brilliant, which is not unexpected, but brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. From Kala Ghoda, from the BIC, who is our collaborator in today's program. Big thanks, Ranjit Hoskote, Prem Chandavarkar.
Thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure. See you all.
See you all. We want to linger and chat.
I know. But when things are